high in the Colorado Rockies, where cell towers can't reach and civilization feels like a distant memory, Jake Morrison heard the crying. For 15 years, the former Army medic had chosen isolation over human contact, haunted by what he'd witnessed in Afghanistan. But this sound, desperate, broken, cut through his carefully built walls like nothing ever had. Behind a cluster of pine trees, he found her, a small donkey, ribs showing through matted fur, fresh wounds across her back, heavily pregnant and barely alive. Someone had beaten her and left her to die in the wilderness. Jake's hands, steady from years of battlefield medicine, trembled as he approached. What he didn't know was that this rescue would shatter everything he thought he understood about the world, because what the donkey was carrying wasn't just a foal, it was something that would reveal why certain people had been drawn to these mountains for centuries, and why Jake's own family had really sent him here all those years ago. But first, could he even keep them both alive through the night? The donkey's eyes tracked his movement as he knelt beside her, brown orbs filled with intelligence that seemed almost human. Jake had seen that look before, in the eyes of wounded soldiers who knew death was close but still clung to hope. The animal's breathing was shallow, labored, and her swollen belly rose and fell in an irregular rhythm that made his medic instincts scream danger. "Easy, girl," he whispered, the sound of his own voice foreign after days of silence. His fingers found her pulse, weak but steady. The wounds on her back were fresh, some still bleeding, carved in patterns that looked almost deliberate. What kind of monster would do this to a pregnant animal? Snow began to fall, fat flakes that would soon become a blizzard. Jake's cabin was a quarter-mile down the mountainside, but moving her would be risky. She was too weak to walk, and carrying a full-grown donkey would be impossible. Yet leaving her here meant certain death. The donkey made a soft sound, somewhere between a whimper and a sigh, and Jake felt something shift inside his chest, a crack in the ice that had formed around his heart after too many friends had died in his arms overseas. He couldn't save them, but maybe he could save her. "All right, let's figure this out," he muttered, standing to assess his options. The old mining trail was too narrow for his truck, but there was an ATV path that came within 50 yards. If he could build a travois, drag her to the path. As if sensing his plan, the donkey struggled to lift her head. Her eyes locked onto his, and Jake felt a jolt of recognition that made no sense. For a moment, it was as if she was trying to tell him something, communicating in a language older than words. The sensation was so strong it left him dizzy. Thunder rumbled overhead, unusual for a snowstorm. The donkey's ears pricked forward, alert despite her condition, and she made a sound Jake had never heard from an animal before, a low, melodic hum that seemed to resonate in his bones. The air around them shimmered briefly, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt, though the temperature was well below freezing. Jake blinked hard, certain he was hallucinating from the thin mountain air. But when his vision cleared, the shimmer was gone, and the donkey was watching him with those impossibly knowing eyes. "What are you?" he whispered. Time was running out. Jake sprinted to his emergency cache, hidden in a nearby rock outcropping, and pulled out a military-grade tarp and climbing rope. Working with practiced efficiency, he fashioned a makeshift stretcher between two fallen branches. The donkey didn't resist as he gently maneuvered her onto the tarp, though her breathing became more labored with each movement. The journey down the mountain was a nightmare of sliding rocks and treacherous footing. Several times, Jake nearly lost his grip on the improvised stretcher, his boots struggling for purchase on the increasingly icy trail. The donkey remained still, but her eyes stayed open, watching the darkening sky with an expression that seemed almost expectant. By the time they reached his cabin, Jake's muscles screamed in protest, and his lungs burned from the exertion. He managed to drag the stretcher onto his covered porch just as the blizzard hit in earnest, wind howling through the pines like the voices of the damned. Inside, the cabin's warmth enveloped them. Jake had built the space himself, one large room with a stone fireplace, a simple kitchen, and a loft bedroom. It wasn't much, but it was clean and dry, and far from the memories that haunted him. The donkey's condition was worse than he'd initially thought. Her temperature was dropping, and when he placed his stethoscope against her swollen belly, what he heard made his blood run cold. 2 heartbeats. But the second one was wrong somehow. Too slow, too steady, with a rhythm unlike anything in his medical training. Outside, the storm raged with supernatural fury, as if the mountains themselves were responding to what he'd brought home. The donkey's breathing had steadied by morning, though Matthias could see the wariness still flickering in her dark eyes when he approached with fresh water and hay. She flinched at his movements, but didn't pull away, a small victory he'd learned to appreciate after years of coaxing wild creatures back to health. "Easy, girl," he murmured, setting the bucket within reach. The cuts on her flanks had stopped bleeding, but the pattern of scars told a story that made his jaw clench. Someone had used her badly, worked her past exhaustion, and beaten her when she could give no more. As she drank, Matthias noticed something odd. The water in the bucket began to shimmer with an almost imperceptible light, like moonbeams dancing on a still pond. He blinked, attributing it to the early morning sun filtering through the cabin's small windows, but when he looked again, the effect had vanished. The donkey raised her head, water dripping from her muzzle, and for a moment their eyes met. There was an intelligence there that struck him as unusual, not just the cunning of a creature that had learned to survive cruelty, but something deeper, something that seemed to recognize him in return. "What are you carrying?" he whispered, though he wasn't sure why the question formed itself that way. Pregnant animals were common enough in these mountains, but something about this one felt different. Over the next 3 days, Matthias fell into a routine of care. The donkey, whom he'd started calling Luna for her pale grey coat, grew stronger and more trusting. She would nicker softly when he approached, and had begun following him around the small paddock he'd fashioned behind the cabin. But the strange phenomena continued. Plants seemed to grow faster where she grazed. The grass became greener, more lush. Matthias might have dismissed it as coincidence, if not for the apple tree. The gnarled old thing hadn't borne fruit in the 5 years since he'd built his cabin here, yet now tiny buds were appearing on branches that had been barren just days before. On the 4th evening, as Matthias sat on his porch whittling a new fence post, Luna approached the cabin's edge and stood perfectly still, her head raised toward the darkening sky. The pose reminded him of something, a statue he'd seen once in the town's old church before he'd fled civilization for these isolated peaks. The memory brought unwelcome thoughts of the world below, of the reasons he'd sought solitude in the first place. His hands, steady as always with wood and blade, trembled slightly as images surfaced, his sister's fever-bright eyes, the priest's mumbled words about God's will, the small grave he'd dug with his own hands. Luna turned and walked to where he sat, her movement fluid despite her condition. She rested her muzzle against his knee, and the trembling in his hands ceased. The weight of old grief didn't disappear, but it shifted somehow, became bearable. "What are you?" he asked aloud this time. That night, Matthias woke to the sound of Luna moving restlessly in the paddock. Through his window he could see her pacing, her sides heaving with contractions, but it was too early. She'd looked to have at least another month to carry. He dressed quickly and stepped outside, expecting to find her in distress. Instead, she stood calmly in the center of the paddock, surrounded by a soft, silvery glow that emanated from her coat itself. The light pulsed gently, in rhythm with some unheard heartbeat. Matthias approached slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might break whatever spell had settled over the mountain clearing. As he drew near, he realized the glow wasn't coming from Luna's coat at all. It was radiating from within her, as if something luminous moved beneath her skin. Luna led him to the small grove of pine trees where he'd first found her. She circled once, twice, then lay down in a patch of soft earth between the ancient roots. The glow intensified, and Matthias heard something that made his breath catch, not the sound of an animal in labor, but something that resembled singing, though no voices were present. He knelt beside her, his weathered hands instinctively moving to provide comfort, though he sensed Luna needed no help with what was about to happen. This birth was following laws older than anything he understood. The singing grew stronger, seeming to rise from the earth itself, and Matthias realized that after 5 years of self-imposed exile, his life was about to change forever. Whatever Luna was bringing into the world would shatter the careful boundaries he'd built around his solitary existence. As the first true contraction seized her, the trees themselves seemed to lean in, as if the entire mountain was holding its breath in anticipation. The first sign something was wrong came at dawn. 3 days after Marcus had brought the donkey home, he woke to an eerie silence, no gentle braying from the makeshift stable he'd constructed behind his cabin, no shuffling of hooves in the straw. Even the mountain birds seemed unusually quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Inside, he found the donkey lying on her side, flanks heaving with labored breathing. Her coat, which had begun to regain some luster under his care, was now slick with sweat despite the cold. But it was her eyes that stopped him short. They glowed with an inner light he'd never seen in any animal before, a soft silver radiance that seemed to pulse with each contraction. The donkey's eyes found his, and in that moment, Marcus felt something pass between them, not quite communication, but an understanding deeper than words. She was afraid, but not of the birth itself. She was afraid of what would happen after. Hours crawled by. Marcus did what he could, bringing fresh water and clean blankets, but mostly he waited. The strange energy in the air intensified, and he began to notice other oddities. The metal tools hanging on the stable walls hummed softly, vibrating without any apparent cause. The compass he kept in his jacket spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. Most unsettling of all, shadows moved wrong, falling upward in some places, pooling in corners where no light should cast them. By midday, the temperature had plummeted further. Ice crystals formed on the stable walls despite the donkey's body heat, creating intricate patterns that looked almost like writing in a language Marcus couldn't read. He found himself studying them, feeling as though they were trying to tell him something important. The donkey's labor intensified as the sun reached its peak, though precious little light penetrated the unnatural gloom that had settled over the mountain. With each contraction, the glow in her eyes brightened, and Marcus swore he could see stars reflected in their depths. Not the reflection of any earthly sky, but constellations he'd never seen before. Then, just as the church bells in the distant valley chimed noon, everything went silent. The donkey's breathing steadied, the humming stopped, and even the wind died away. In that profound quiet, Marcus heard something impossible, a sound like singing, faint and ethereal, coming from somewhere beyond the stable walls. The birth happened quickly after that. One moment the donkey was straining, the next a small form slipped into the world, landing softly in the straw Marcus had prepared. But as he leaned forward to clear the newborn's airways, his hands froze in midair. It wasn't a foal. The creature before him was unlike anything in his experience or imagination. About the size of a newborn donkey, it had 4 legs and a basic equine shape, but its coat was pure white and seemed to emit its own gentle luminescence. Where a mane should be, flowing wisps of what looked like starlight cascaded down its neck. Most striking of all was the small, spiraled horn emerging from its forehead, pearl white and translucent, with veins of silver running through it like captured lightning. Marcus sat back on his heels, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Unicorn. The word came unbidden to his thoughts, though his rational mind rejected it immediately. Such things belonged in fairy tales, not in a rough stable on a Colorado mountainside. Yet here it was, very real and very much alive, trying to lift its head with the determined instinct of all newborns. The infant creature, the unicorn, because Marcus could no longer deny what it was, struggled to its feet with wobbly determination. Its eyes, when they found Marcus, held an intelligence that seemed ancient despite its newborn state. In that gaze, he saw wisdom beyond years, knowledge of secrets hidden since the world was young. Outside, the temperature began to return to normal, and the first rays of genuine sunlight pierced the dissipating gloom. But Marcus knew that nothing would ever be normal again. He had become guardian to a miracle, keeper of a legend made flesh. The unicorn took its first tentative steps toward him. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke as Marcus carried another armload of firewood into the cabin. Rain lashed against the windows with increasing fury, and he could hear the wind howling through the pine trees like something wild and hungry. He glanced toward the lean-to where Sage had taken shelter, grateful he'd reinforced the structure just last week. Thunder rolled across the mountains, deep and resonant, seeming to shake the very foundations of his small home. Marcus had weathered countless storms in these hills, but something about this one felt different. The air itself seemed charged with an energy that made his skin prickle and his teeth ache. He was stoking the fire when he heard it, a sound that made him freeze with the poker halfway to the logs. It wasn't quite a bray, wasn't quite a cry of pain, but something that seemed to contain both and more, something that spoke of a struggle far beyond the physical. Marcus dropped the poker and rushed outside into the driving rain. The cold hit him like a physical blow, and within seconds his shirt was plastered to his skin. He fought his way through the wind to the lean-to, where he found Sage lying on her side in the thick straw bedding, her flanks heaving with effort. "Easy, girl," he murmured, though his voice was nearly lost in the storm's fury. "Easy now." Her dark eyes found his, and in them he saw something that stopped his breath. Not just pain or fear, but an intelligence so profound it seemed almost human. No, more than human. Ancient, as if she carried within her the wisdom of ages, the weight of secrets too vast for mortal understanding. Another contraction seized her, and this time the sound she made was definitely not of this world. It resonated in frequencies that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to his bones, his blood, his very soul. The hair on his arms stood on end, and for a moment the air around them shimmered like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Marcus had helped birth enough animals to know the signs, but this was unlike anything in his experience. With each labored breath Sage took, the very atmosphere seemed to pulse. The rain drumming on the lean-to's roof took on an almost musical quality, as if the storm itself was responding to whatever was happening here. He knelt beside her in the straw, his hands hovering uncertainly over her swollen sides. Every instinct told him to help, but another deeper instinct warned him that this was beyond his understanding, beyond perhaps anyone's understanding. This wasn't just the birth of a foal, this was something else entirely. The wind suddenly died to an eerie calm, though he could still hear it raging in the distance. The rain continued to fall, but softer now, almost gentle. Even the thunder seemed muted, as if the storm was holding its breath along with him. Sage's breathing changed, becoming deeper, more rhythmic. Her eyes closed, and for a terrifying moment Marcus thought he was losing her. But then she opened them again, and they were filled with a light that definitely wasn't reflected from anywhere else. It came from within, soft and golden and utterly impossible. He reached out tentatively and placed his hand on her neck. Her coat was warm, far warmer than it should have been in the cold rain, and beneath his palm he could feel something that wasn't quite a heartbeat. It was more complex than that, like multiple rhythms layering over each other in perfect harmony, like a symphony written in flesh and blood, and something far more ethereal. "What are you?" he whispered, though he didn't expect an answer. Sage turned her great head toward him, and in her eyes he saw something that might have been a smile. Then another contraction took her, and this time the golden light that had been contained in her eyes began to spread, flowing down her neck and across her body like liquid starlight. The lean-to filled with warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with presence. Marcus felt tears on his cheeks without knowing when he'd started crying. This was sacred, he realized. Whatever was happening here was holy in a way that had nothing to do with churches or prayers and everything to do with the fundamental mystery of existence itself. The light grew brighter, and Marcus had to shield his eyes. But even through his fingers, he could see that something was emerging, something that caught and reflected the impossible radiance like a prism splitting sunlight into rainbows, something that was definitely not a foal. As the light reached its crescendo, the storm outside suddenly stopped. Not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had thrown a switch. The silence was deafening after hours of wind and rain. Even the normal sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of night birds, had ceased entirely. The world held its breath, waiting to see what would emerge from the golden light now filling every corner of the lean-to. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the world crystalline and strange. Marcus woke to an unfamiliar sound, not the harsh braying he'd grown accustomed to, but something softer, almost musical. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside, his breath forming white clouds in the crisp air. Delilah stood in the paddock, her head lowered toward something small and dark against the snow. Marcus's heart quickened as he approached the fence. There, nestled close to her warm flank, was the foal he'd been expecting for weeks. But as he climbed over the wooden rails, his steps slowed. The creature wasn't quite what he'd anticipated. It was smaller than a typical donkey foal, with impossibly delicate legs that seemed too fragile to support even its slight weight. Its coat was deep charcoal, almost black, but as the morning light struck it, iridescent threads of blue and silver seemed to shimmer beneath the surface. "Well, I'll be damned," Marcus whispered, crouching down at a respectful distance. The foal lifted its head at the sound of his voice, and Marcus felt his breath catch. Its eyes were unlike anything he'd ever seen, large and luminous, with an intelligence that seemed far too ancient for something born mere hours ago. They were the color of storm clouds shot through with lightning, grey and silver with flecks of electric blue. Delilah nickered softly, as if introducing them. The foal struggled to its feet, wobbling slightly before finding its balance. Marcus noticed that its hooves weren't the typical dull black of a donkey's, but seemed to gleam like polished obsidian. He blinked hard and looked again. Normal shadow, normal foal. He shook his head, attributing the vision to too little sleep and too much worry. "What are you, little one?" he murmured. Over the following days, Marcus threw himself into caring for the new arrival. He'd delivered plenty of animals in his years on the mountain, but this birth felt different somehow. The foal, which he'd taken to calling Storm because of those remarkable eyes, displayed behaviors that constantly surprised him. Unlike most newborns, Storm rarely slept during the day. Instead, the foal would stand at the paddock fence, gazing up at the mountain peaks with an intensity that was almost unsettling. When clouds gathered around the highest summits, Storm would become agitated, pacing and calling out in sounds that seemed more like songs than brays. The local wildlife had begun acting strangely too. Ravens that normally gave the ranch a wide berth now perched on the fence posts, watching Storm with what Marcus could only describe as reverence. A family of deer had taken to grazing just beyond the property line, and twice Marcus had spotted a magnificent elk standing sentinel on the ridge above the house. Most unnerving of all were the dreams. Since Storm's birth, Marcus's sleep had been filled with visions of ancient ceremonies, of robed figures standing in circles of standing stones he'd never seen but somehow recognized. In these dreams, creatures that looked like Storm but fully grown danced beneath starlit skies, their movements creating patterns of light that hung in the air like aurora. He'd wake with fragments of words in languages he didn't know echoing in his mind, and a strange tingling in his fingertips as if he'd been touching something electric. On the fourth morning after Storm's birth, Marcus discovered the first truly undeniable sign that something extraordinary was happening. He was checking the water trough when he noticed strange marks in the mud beside it. At first glance they looked like ordinary hoof prints, but there were too many of them, and they seemed to be arranged in deliberate patterns. As he knelt to examine them more closely, he realized they formed a perfect spiral, each print slightly overlapping the next. But that wasn't the strangest part. Around each hoof print, the grass had grown overnight into small, perfect circles of emerald green, startlingly vivid against the brown winter earth. Marcus sat back on his heels, his mind racing. He'd lived on this mountain for 15 years, and he'd never seen anything like it. Plants didn't grow in winter, not like this, and certainly not in response to an animal's footsteps. Storm appeared at his elbow, having somehow left the paddock despite the gate being latched. The foal nuzzled his shoulder gently, and Marcus felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the weak winter sun. "What are you trying to tell me?" he asked softly. Storm's storm-colored eyes met his, and for a moment Marcus could have sworn he heard a voice that wasn't quite a voice whisper in his mind. "Soon, Guardian. Soon you will understand." The foal trotted back toward the paddock, leaving Marcus alone with the impossible circles of green grass and the growing certainty that his quiet life was about to change forever. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like gossamer threads when Ezra noticed the donkey's restlessness had intensified. Minerva paced the small enclosure he'd built for her, her swollen sides heaving with each labored breath. Her dark eyes held an intelligence that unnerved him, as if she understood something he didn't. He delivered enough foals and calves in his younger days to recognize the signs. Labor was imminent. "Easy, girl," he murmured, approaching slowly with a bucket of fresh water. "Let's get you somewhere more comfortable." The old barn behind his cabin would have to do. He'd cleared it out the previous week, laying down fresh straw and ensuring the space was clean and dry. Minerva followed him willingly, her trust in him absolute despite whatever horrors she'd endured before. As the hours passed, Ezra found himself pacing almost as much as the donkey. Something felt different about this birth. The air itself seemed charged with an energy he couldn't identify. The birds had gone silent, and even the wind through the pines had stilled to an unnatural quiet. When Minerva's contractions began in earnest, Ezra positioned himself nearby with towels and warm water, prepared to assist if needed. But as the birth progressed, he realized this was unlike anything in his experience. The first sign was the light. It started as a faint glow emanating from Minerva herself, so subtle he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. But as her labor intensified, the luminescence grew stronger, casting dancing shadows on the barn walls. The donkey's coat seemed to shimmer with an inner fire, and her breath came in silver puffs despite the warm spring air. Ezra's hands trembled as he watched, torn between the impulse to flee and an overwhelming need to witness whatever was about to unfold. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was impossible, but years of mountain solitude had taught him that the world held mysteries beyond human understanding. When the foal finally emerged, Ezra's breath caught in his throat. The creature was unlike any donkey he'd ever seen. Its coat was pure white, almost translucent, and seemed to capture and reflect a strange light that still pulsed around Minerva. But it was the foal's eyes that stopped his heart. They were ancient, wise, and glowed with the soft blue-white radiance of starlight. As Minerva began cleaning her offspring with gentle nudges, the light gradually faded, leaving only the natural illumination filtering through the barn's weathered boards. But Ezra could still see something otherworldly in the foal's bearing, the way it held its small head with regal dignity even minutes after birth. "What are you?" he whispered, the words barely audible. The foal tilted its head as if considering the question, then took its first tentative steps toward him. Each hoofbeat seemed to resonate with a musical quality, like distant chimes carried on an unfelt breeze. When it reached Ezra, it pressed its small muzzle against his weathered palm. The contact sent warmth spreading up his arm, followed by something he hadn't felt in decades, a profound sense of peace. The weight of grief and isolation that had driven him to these mountains began to lift, replaced by a feeling of purpose he'd thought lost forever. Minerva watched the interaction with approval, her own eyes now reflecting some of that same otherworldly glow. She approached and gently nudged Ezra's shoulder, as if formally introducing him to her remarkable offspring. "I don't understand what's happening here," Ezra admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But I swear to you both, I'll protect this little one with my life." The foal seemed to understand, pressing closer against his legs with a soft whicker that sounded almost like contentment. As if responding to some unspoken agreement, both animals settled down in the fresh straw, the mother keeping her foal close while maintaining visual contact with Ezra. As evening approached, Ezra found himself reluctant to leave the barn. The implications of what he'd witnessed were staggering, but one thing was certain: his life had irrevocably changed. Whatever this creature was, wherever it had come from, it was now his responsibility. He thought of the old legends his grandmother used to tell, stories of magical beings hidden in the deepest parts of the mountains, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves to the world. He'd dismissed them as folklore, but now he wondered if those tales held more truth than he'd ever imagined. The foal's eyes opened briefly, meeting his gaze across the dim barn, and Ezra felt that strange warmth again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, but tonight he would simply stand guard over this miracle that had wandered into his solitary existence. The creature had been with them for 3 days now, and Ezra still found himself stealing glances at it whenever he thought it wasn't looking, which was foolish, because those ancient golden eyes seemed to see everything, even when the small dragon appeared to be sleeping curled against Marta's warm flank. Dragon. The word still felt foreign in his mind, like trying to swallow a stone, yet what else could he call it? The gossamer wings that caught sunlight like stained glass, the scales that shifted color from deep emerald to silver depending on the light, the way it moved with liquid grace despite being no larger than a house cat. Everything about it defied the natural order he'd spent 47 years understanding. On the morning of the 4th day, Ezra discovered the creature could do more than simply exist impossibly. He'd risen before dawn, as was his habit, moving quietly through his morning routine of checking on Marta and stoking the fire. The dragon was nowhere to be seen, which had happened before. It seemed to come and go as it pleased, though it always returned to Marta's side by evening. He was measuring oats for Marta's breakfast when movement outside the window caught his eye. The dragon perched on the fence post, wings spread wide to catch the first rays of sunrise filtering through the pine canopy. But something was wrong with the light. Instead of the normal golden glow of early morning, the beam seemed to bend and twist around the creature, forming patterns that made Ezra's eyes water when he tried to focus on them. The dragon tilted its head toward the forest, and suddenly the twisted light shot outward like arrows, piercing the gloom between the trees. Where each beam touched, something changed. Ezra watched in stunned silence as withered undergrowth straightened and bloomed, as a dead pine began to show fresh green needles, as flowers he'd never seen before pushed up through the frost-hardened earth. Within minutes, a patch of forest that had been dying from some blight was transformed into a small paradise of impossible vitality. The dragon folded its wings and hopped down from the post, apparently satisfied with its work. Ezra set down the measuring cup with shaking hands. He'd witnessed something that belonged in the old stories his grandmother used to tell, tales of creatures that could heal the land itself. But those were just stories, weren't they? Myths created by people who didn't understand the world's harsh realities. Yet the evidence spread before him, undeniable as the sunrise. Later that morning, while the dragon dozed in a patch of sunlight, Ezra found himself studying the maps his father had left behind. Most showed the familiar territory he'd known all his life, but tucked beneath them was something he'd never paid much attention to before. Hand-drawn on what looked like much older paper, it depicted the mountain range with strange symbols scattered across it. Circles and spirals, interwoven patterns that seemed to pulse and shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. One symbol appeared repeatedly, always at high elevations. It looked remarkably like a stylized dragon. Marta nickered softly from her stall, and Ezra looked up to see the dragon had awakened. It stood at the edge of its sunbeam, those golden eyes fixed on the map in Ezra's hands. For a long moment they regarded each other across the cabin's main room. Then the dragon did something that stopped Ezra's breath entirely. It began to glow, not with reflected sunlight, but with an inner radiance that seemed to come from its very bones. The light pulsed in rhythm with something Ezra could feel in his chest, like a second heartbeat he'd never noticed before. The creature moved toward him with deliberate steps, never breaking eye contact. When it reached the table, where the map lay spread, it stretched up on its hind legs and placed one delicate claw on the paper. The ancient symbols responded immediately, flaring to life with the same golden radiance that emanated from the dragon. Ezra found himself leaning closer, despite every instinct telling him to pull back. The symbols weren't just marks on paper anymore. They were alive, telling a story he could almost understand. Images flashed through his mind, other dragons, much larger than this one, soaring between mountain peaks that scraped the belly of the sky, caves that glowed with inner fire, men and women working alongside the great creatures to tend forests that stretched beyond the horizon. And then darkness. Something vast and hungry swallowing the light, driving the dragons into hiding, forcing them to become legend rather than reality. The vision faded, leaving Ezra gasping as if he'd been underwater. The dragon had released the map and stepped back, but its eyes never left his face. In those golden depths, Ezra saw something that made his chest tight with emotion he couldn't name. Hope, ancient, patient, and absolutely unwavering. The creature was waiting for something, had been waiting for a very long time, and somehow, impossibly, it was waiting for him. The transformation began at dawn. Elias woke to find Mira standing perfectly still in the center of the clearing, her coat shimmering with an otherworldly luminescence that made the morning mist appear dull by comparison. The foal, if it could still be called that, stood beside her, no longer the fragile creature from the night before. It had grown during the few hours of sleep, now standing nearly 3 feet tall, its silver mane flowing like liquid starlight. "What, in God's name?" Elias whispered, rubbing his eyes. The sight didn't change. The creature turned toward him, and those ancient eyes held recognition, intelligence, and something else, gratitude. When it stepped forward, its hooves left prints that glowed briefly in the earth before fading. Mira nickered softly, a sound filled with pride and exhaustion. Elias approached slowly, his weathered hands trembling. The foal, no, the young unicorn, lowered its head, allowing him to touch the spiraling horn that had emerged overnight. It felt warm, solid, and hummed with an energy that made his fingertips tingle. "I've lost my mind," he muttered. 20 years alone on this mountain, and I've finally cracked. But Mira's gentle nudge against his shoulder felt real enough. The morning air carried scents of pine and wildflowers, enhanced somehow, as if the unicorn's presence had awakened something dormant in the world around them. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds more melodious. A rustling in the underbrush shattered the peaceful moment. Elias spun around to see 3 figures emerging from the tree line, 2 men in expensive hunting gear and a woman wearing dark clothing that seemed to absorb light. The lead man, barrel-chested with cold eyes, held a rifle casually across his chest. "Well, well," the man said, his voice carrying a familiar cruelty that made Elias's blood run cold. "Looks like our little treasure hunt paid off after all." Elias recognized him immediately. Marcus Crane, the man who'd beaten Mira, who'd left her for dead. Behind him stood another hunter and the strange woman whose presence seemed to leach warmth from the air. "You thought you could hide up here forever, old man?" Crane continued, raising his rifle. "That beast belongs to me. Do you have any idea what it's worth?" The woman stepped forward, her pale eyes fixed on the unicorn with hungry intensity. "Mr. Crane, if I may. The creature is far more valuable alive and unharmed. There are collectors who would pay extraordinary sums." Mira positioned herself protectively in front of her offspring, ears flattened, teeth bared. The unicorn seemed to sense the danger, its horn beginning to glow with soft, pearl-like radiance. "How did you find us?" Elias demanded, though he was already moving toward his cabin where his shotgun waited by the door. "Tracking device," Crane sneered. "Implanted in the donkey months ago. We've been monitoring her location, waiting. When she stopped moving for more than 12 hours, we knew it was time." The second hunter circled to the right, trying to flank them. Elias calculated distances, 20 feet to his cabin, 15 feet between him and the nearest threat. The woman worried him most. Something about her felt wrong, unnatural. The ancients called them guardians, she said, almost conversationally. Protectors of the thin places where magic seeps through. Kill one guardian and you can seal those places forever. Capture one alive. She smiled, and her teeth seemed too sharp. Well, that opens far more interesting possibilities. The unicorn took a step forward, its horn blazing brighter. Where its hooves touched the ground, wildflowers bloomed instantly, spreading in ripples across the clearing. The air itself seemed to thicken with power. Crane raised his rifle, but before he could fire, the mountain answered. The mountain's protecting them, the second hunter whispered, backing away. Impossible, the woman hissed, but her certainty was cracking like the ground beneath them. Elias seized the moment, lunging for his cabin as chaos erupted behind him. The unicorn's cry pierced the air, not the bleat of a donkey, but a sound like crystal bells mixed with wind through mountain peaks. The sound struck the intruders like a physical blow, sending them staggering. His fingers closed around the shotgun just as a bullet splintered the doorframe beside his head. Rolling behind the cabin's thick log walls, he pumped the action and chambered around. When he peered around the corner, the clearing had transformed into something from a fever dream. The unicorn stood in the center of a growing circle of impossible flowers, its horn now blazing like a star. Mira reared and struck at Crane, her hooves finding their mark against the man who had tormented her. But the woman was chanting in a language that predated human civilization, her hands weaving patterns in the air that left trails of darkness. The real battle was just beginning. The morning light filtered through the cabin windows as Marcus watched the newborn creature sleep beside Gilda. 3 days had passed since the birth, and the foal, if it could still be called that, had grown at an impossible rate. What had emerged no larger than a typical donkey foal now stood nearly 3 feet tall, its body elongating and taking on proportions that defied nature. The horn had become more pronounced, spiraling with delicate ridges that caught the light like polished ivory. Silver markings traced along its legs and neck in patterns that seemed to shift when Marcus wasn't looking directly at them. Most unsettling were its eyes, deep pools of amber intelligence that followed his every movement with an awareness that made his skin crawl. Marcus had always prided himself on his practical nature, his ability to explain away the strange occurrences that others claimed to witness in these ancient mountains. But there was no explaining this. No rationalizing what Gilda had brought into his world. The creature stirred, rising on legs that moved with impossible grace. It approached Marcus without fear, pressing its muzzle against his weathered palm. The touch sent warmth shooting up his arm, and for a moment images flashed through his mind, visions of vast forests untouched by human hands, of beings that walked between shadow and light, of a time when magic flowed through the world like water through stone. "What are you?" Marcus whispered, his voice hoarse with wonder and fear. The creature tilted its head, and Marcus could have sworn he saw understanding in those amber eyes. It moved past him toward the cabin door, looking back expectantly. When Marcus made no move to follow, it returned and gently grasped his sleeve between its teeth, tugging him forward. "You want to go outside?" Marcus glanced at Gilda, who watched them both with calm acceptance. "I don't think that's wise. What if someone sees you?" But the creature was insistent, and something in its manner suggested this wasn't mere curiosity. There was purpose in its movements, urgency in the way it kept returning to the door. Finally, Marcus relented, checking carefully before opening the door to the morning air. The creature stepped onto the porch and immediately became still, its head raised toward the mountain peaks. A low sound emerged from its throat, not quite a whinny, not quite a song, but something that seemed to resonate in Marcus's bones. The forest around them fell silent, as if every living thing had paused to listen. Then, impossibly, an answer came. From somewhere high in the mountains, carried on the wind, came a similar call. The creature's ears pricked forward, and it took several steps toward the sound before stopping and looking back at Marcus. "There are others," Marcus breathed, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. You're not alone." The creature returned to his side, pressing against his leg with obvious affection, but its gaze remained fixed on the distant peaks. Marcus found himself studying the mountains with new eyes, wondering what other secrets they held, what other impossibilities might be hidden in their remote valleys and forgotten caves. A new sound reached them, the distant rumble of an engine working its way up the mountain road. Marcus tensed, instinctively moving between the creature and the approaching vehicle. Visitors were rare this high up, and after his encounter with Elena Thorne, any unexpected arrival filled him with dread. Inside, he urged, guiding the creature back into the cabin. Quickly. The foal obeyed without resistance, settling beside Gilda as if it understood the need for concealment. Marcus closed the door and moved to the window, watching as a familiar truck rounded the bend, Doc Henderson's old Ford struggling with the steep grade. Relief flooded through him. Doc was one of the few people he trusted, but even so, Marcus found himself wondering if the veterinarian could be counted on to keep silent about what he might witness. As the truck pulled up to the cabin, Marcus made a quick decision. "Stay here," he told Gilda and her offspring. "I'll handle this." He stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind him, just as Doc Henderson climbed down from his truck. The older man looked concerned, his medical bag in hand. "Marcus, I've been worried about you," Doc said, approaching the porch. "I heard there was some trouble with that Thorne woman and her people. Thought I'd check on Gilda and see how the birthing went." "Everything's fine," Marcus replied, perhaps too quickly. "Gilda's recovering well." Doc's experienced eyes studied Marcus's face, noting the tension, the way he positioned himself in front of the door. "Mind if I take a look at her? Professional courtesy and all." Marcus felt trapped between his trust in Doc and his need to protect the secret growing inside his cabin. The creature's call to its kind still echoed in his memory, and he knew that whatever was beginning, there would be no stopping it. The mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting for his decision. The creature's golden eyes fixed on Thomas with an intelligence that made his breath catch. It stood no taller than his knee, but there was something ancient and profound in its gaze that spoke of wisdom far beyond its apparent youth. The small horn spiraling from its forehead caught the lamplight, casting rainbow prisms across the cave walls. "What are you?" Thomas whispered, though he suspected he already knew. The old stories his grandmother had told him rushed back, tales of the last of the pure ones, hidden away from a world that had forgotten magic. The unicorn foal took a tentative step toward him, its silver hooves making no sound on the stone floor. Behind it, Maggie watched with protective alertness, though she seemed calmer now that her offspring had emerged safely into the world. Thomas remained perfectly still as the foal approached. When it was close enough, it stretched its neck forward and touched his outstretched hand with its velvet muzzle. The contact sent a jolt through him, not painful but overwhelming. Images flooded his mind, vast forests untouched by human hands, crystal streams singing with life and beings of light dancing under starlit skies. He saw the world as it once was, before the magic began to fade. The vision lasted only seconds, but when it ended, Thomas found tears streaming down his cheeks. The foal stepped back, tilting its head as if studying his reaction. "You're the reason they were after her," Thomas said, understanding flooding through him. Someone knew what she carried. As if summoned by his words, the sound of engines rumbled in the distance. Thomas's blood ran cold. He'd hoped they had more time, but the men who'd been hunting Maggie had found them. "Stay calm, girl," he murmured to Maggie, who had begun to pace nervously. The foal pressed close to its mother's side, its earlier boldness replaced by instinctive caution. Thomas moved to the cave entrance and peered through the camouflaged opening. 3 vehicles were making their way up the mountain road, their headlights cutting through the morning mist. He counted at least 8 figures in dark clothing emerging from the trucks when they stopped at the base of the trail leading to his property. His mind raced. The cave was well hidden, but these men had resources and determination. They would search methodically until they found what they were looking for. He thought of the weapons they'd likely brought, the tranquilizer guns that would reduce the magnificent creature behind him to a commodity to be studied, caged, or worse. "No," he said aloud, surprising himself with the steel in his voice. "Not happening." Thomas had lived as a hermit for 15 years, avoiding confrontation and human contact whenever possible. But as he looked back at Maggie and her extraordinary foal, something shifted inside him. Some lines couldn't be crossed. Some things were worth fighting for. He gathered supplies quickly: rope, his hunting rifle, the emergency radio he'd never had cause to use. The foal watched his preparations with those impossibly wise eyes, and Thomas found himself speaking to it as he worked. "Your kind trusted humans once, didn't they? Before we let you down." He checked his rifle's ammunition. "Maybe it's time one of us earned that trust back." The unicorn made a sound, not quite a whinny, more like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. When Thomas looked at it, he could swear it nodded. Through the cave entrance, he could hear voices getting closer. The searchers had reached his cabin and were spreading out from there. He had perhaps 20 minutes before they discovered the hidden path that led to this sanctuary. "Listen to me," Thomas said, kneeling beside Maggie and stroking her neck. "I'm going to lead them away from here. There's enough food and water for several days. Keep your baby hidden until I come back." Maggie's dark eyes reflected understanding, and she nuzzled his shoulder gently. The foal approached again, this time touching its horn to Thomas's arm. Another flash of images, himself moving through the forest with impossible stealth, finding paths he'd never known existed, understanding the mountain's secrets as if they were his own memories. When the vision faded, Thomas felt different, stronger, more connected to the wild place he'd called home for so many years. The mountain itself seemed to be offering its protection, sharing its ancient knowledge of hidden ways and secret passages. "Thank you," he whispered to the foal, then shouldered his pack and rifle. At the cave entrance, he paused for one last look at the pair, the faithful donkey who had carried such a precious burden, and the unicorn foal whose very existence proved that magic still lived in the world. Whatever happened next, he would make sure they remained safe and free. The voices were closer now, harsh and demanding in the morning stillness. Thomas slipped from the cave and began making his way down the mountain, deliberately leaving enough of a trail for skilled trackers to follow. He was no longer running from the world, he was drawing it away from something infinitely more valuable than his own solitude. The storm had passed, leaving the mountain air crisp and sharp, with the scent of snow and pine. Marcus stood at the cabin window, watching Vera graze peacefully in the small meadow, while Luna played nearby, her silvery coat catching the morning sunlight like captured starlight. The foal's horn had grown longer in recent weeks, now a delicate spiral of pearl and moonstone that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. 3 months had passed since Luna's birth, and Marcus had grown accustomed to the daily miracles that followed in her wake. Flowers bloomed where she stepped, even through patches of snow. Small woodland creatures would emerge from hiding just to be near her, as if drawn by some invisible force. Yesterday, he'd watched in amazement as she'd approached an injured hawk with a broken wing, touching it gently with her horn. Within moments, the bird had taken flight, completely healed. But with each passing day, Marcus felt the weight of an approaching decision. Luna was growing stronger, more aware of her powers, and he could see in her large, knowing eyes that she sensed something calling to her from deeper in the mountains. A knock at the door shattered the morning peace. Marcus froze, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle mounted above the fireplace. No one came to his cabin uninvited. No one even knew where to find it. Through the window, he glimpsed an elderly woman standing on his porch, her silver hair braided with what appeared to be small crystals that caught the light. She wore robes of deep forest green, and her weathered hands rested on a walking staff carved from what looked like ancient oak. "Marcus Thornfield," she called out, her voice carrying despite its gentle tone. "I mean no harm. My name is Alara, and I've come a very long way to speak with you about the young one." Marcus's blood ran cold. He glanced toward the meadow where Luna had stopped playing and was now staring directly at the stranger, her horn beginning to glow with a soft, anticipatory light. Reluctantly, Marcus opened the door but kept his body blocking the entrance. "I don't know what you're talking about." Elara smiled, and her eyes crinkled with genuine warmth. "I think you do. May I come in? There's much you need to understand about Luna's heritage and the role you've been chosen to play." The use of Luna's name hit Marcus like a physical blow. "How do you know her name? Know where to find you?" Elara's expression grew more serious. "Because I'm one of the Guardians, Marcus. We've been protecting the ancient bloodlines for over 1,000 years, waiting for the prophecy to unfold." Against his better judgment, Marcus stepped aside. Something about the woman's presence felt both foreign and familiar, like a half-remembered dream. As she entered the cabin, Vera let out a long, low bray from the meadow, not of alarm, but of what sounded almost like recognition. Elara moved to the window and gazed out at Luna, who had begun walking slowly toward the cabin. "She's magnificent," the old woman whispered. "The last of her line, born in secrecy and raised in love. You've done well, Marcus." "I don't understand any of this," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion. "I just found Vera abandoned and hurt. I was trying to help." "You were chosen," Elara replied, turning back to him. "Do you think it was mere chance that led you to find Vera at exactly the right moment? That brought you, a man capable of loving without question, to care for something beyond your understanding?" She moved to the simple wooden table and spread out what appeared to be an ancient map, its edges yellowed with age and marked with symbols Marcus didn't recognize. At the center of the map, a location deep in the mountains was marked with a star. "The Sanctuary of the First Light," Elara explained, tracing the path with her finger. "It's where Luna belongs, where she'll find others of her kind and learn to use her gifts fully. The location has been hidden for centuries, protected by ancient magic, but the time of concealment is ending." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "You want to take her away?" "I want her to fulfill her destiny," Elara corrected gently. "As do you, if you're honest with yourself. You've seen how she's changing, how she's outgrowing this small world. She needs to be with her own kind, to learn the old ways." Outside, Luna had reached the porch steps. Through the window, Marcus could see her looking directly at him, and for a moment he could have sworn he heard her voice in his mind, filled with love and understanding. "The choice isn't whether she goes," Elara continued softly. "The choice is whether you go with her. The sanctuary needs a guardian, someone who understands the bond between human and unicorn, someone who's already proven his devotion." Marcus stared at the map, at the winding path that led away from everything he'd known for the past 15 years, towards something unimaginable and extraordinary. The ancient caverns stretched deeper into the mountain than Thomas had ever imagined possible. Following the crystalline light that emanated from Kira's horn, they descended through passages carved by forces far older than human memory. The walls pulsed with veins of silver and gold that seemed to respond to their presence, brightening as they approached. Bella's hooves clicked rhythmically against the stone floor, her breathing steady despite the steep descent. She had grown stronger since Kira's birth, as if the magical nature of her offspring had somehow enhanced her own vitality. Thomas marveled at how she navigated the treacherous path with sure-footed confidence, as though she had walked these tunnels before. "The way becomes familiar," Kira's voice whispered in his mind, her mental touch now as natural as breathing. "Mother remembers what she never knew she knew." They emerged into a vast chamber that took Thomas's breath away. The ceiling soared impossibly high, disappearing into darkness above them, but it was what lay before them that stopped him in his tracks. Carved into the far wall was an enormous relief depicting scenes that seemed to move in the flickering light. Unicorns running alongside humans, working together to tend gardens that bloomed with impossible colors, healing the sick, bringing rain to drought-stricken lands. The old covenant, Thomas whispered, understanding flooding through him as if awakened from a long sleep. Kira stepped forward, her horn blazing brighter now, and the carvings responded with an answering glow. Suddenly the chamber filled with echoes of voices, not heard but felt, telling stories of a time when magic and humanity lived in harmony. Thomas saw flashes of memory that weren't his own, his grandfather as a young man, standing in this very chamber, accepting a responsibility that had been passed down through generations. "Your bloodline has been guardian to ours for 1,000 years," Kira explained, her young voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. "When the world grew dark and magic was driven into hiding, your ancestors helped our kind find refuge in these mountains. But the bond was broken when fear overcame trust." Thomas felt the truth of it in his bones. This was why he had always felt called to these peaks, why he could never truly leave. His isolation hadn't been escape, it had been preparation. A new sound echoed through the chamber, harsh and discordant against the mystical harmonies. Heavy footsteps and shouting voices carried down from the passages above. Reynolds and his team had found the cave entrance. "They bring iron," Kira said, her light flickering with distress. "Iron that burns and binds. They would cage what should run free." Thomas's hand instinctively went to the rifle slung across his shoulder, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. Not against Reynolds's determination and resources. But as his fingers closed around the stock, he felt something else, a tingling warmth that spread up his arm. Bella stepped closer, nuzzling his shoulder with unusual insistence. When he looked into her large, dark eyes, he saw intelligence there that went far beyond any ordinary animal. She had been chosen too, he realized. Chosen to carry hope back into a world that had forgotten magic existed. "The covenant can be renewed," Kira said, moving to stand between Thomas and Bella. "But it requires sacrifice. The Guardian must choose safety in hiding or trust in the face of danger." "What do you need me to do?" Thomas asked. Instead of answering with words, Kira approached him and gently touched her horn to his forehead. Light exploded behind his eyes, and suddenly he could feel everything. Every creature in the mountain, every root and stone, every breath of wind in the passages above. The mountain itself was alive, had always been alive, waiting for someone to listen. Power flowed through him, ancient and wild and terrifying in its intensity. He understood now why his grandfather had seemed so haunted in his final years, carrying secrets too large for one man to bear. But Thomas also felt something his grandfather had lost: hope. "Together," he said, placing one hand on Bella's neck and extending the other toward Kira. "We face this together." The chamber erupted in light as the three of them connected, their bond creating something greater than the sum of its parts. The carved walls came alive, scenes flowing like water as the ancient magic awakened. Thomas felt his consciousness expand, touching every corner of the mountain, and beyond it, sensing others, magical creatures that had been in hiding, waiting for this moment. Reynolds's shouts echoed closer now, harsh with frustration and growing anger. Thomas smiled grimly. Let them come. The Guardian was awake at last, and this time he wouldn't face the darkness alone. The mountain itself began to sing. The storm that had been building all day finally broke just as Thomas finished securing the last of the shutters. Rain lashed against the cabin walls with unusual fury, and the wind howled through the pines like something alive and angry. Inside, Ember huddled close to Sage, her luminous coat dimmed with worry. "It's not natural," Sage said, her ears pinned back as another tremendous crack of thunder shook the foundation. "This storm carries malice." Thomas had been thinking the same thing. The air pressure felt wrong, heavy with an electricity that made his teeth ache. Through the reinforced windows, the darkness seemed absolute, as if something had swallowed the very concept of light. A sharp rap at the door made them all freeze. 3 precise knocks, deliberate and measured. "Nobody travels in weather like this," Thomas muttered, reaching for the rifle mounted above the fireplace. "Stay back." But before he could reach the weapon, the door burst inward with a sound like splintering bones. The wind didn't enter. Instead, a figure stepped through, and the storm seemed to recoil from the threshold. The woman was tall and severe, her silver hair pulled back in an intricate braid that seemed to move with its own current. Her clothes were dry despite the deluge outside, and her eyes held the cold depth of winter lakes. When she smiled, Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. "Seraphina Blackthorne," she said, as if introducing herself at a dinner party, "and you must be the hermit who's been harboring stolen property." Ember's light flared bright enough to banish shadows from every corner of the room. The young unicorn stepped forward, her horn gleaming like polished silver. "You have no claim here, Harvester." "Ah, but I do." Seraphina reached into her coat and withdrew a scroll bound with black ribbon. The covenant of binding signed in blood and starlight 3 centuries ago. The mountain folk pledged their magical offspring to the circle in exchange for protection from the wars below. "Your mother broke that covenant when she fled." "My mother died free," Ember said, her voice steady despite her youth. "And I choose my own path." Seraphina's laugh was like breaking glass. "Choice? Child, you understand so little. Your horn contains enough concentrated magic to power our rituals for decades. Your blood can open doorways between worlds. Your very existence is currency in exchanges you cannot comprehend." Thomas found his voice, though it came out rougher than intended. "She's not property. She's family. Family." Seraphina turned her attention to him, and he felt something cold and invasive probe at the edges of his thoughts. "How quaint! Tell me, hermit, what would you sacrifice to keep her? Your sanity, your soul, your precious donkey?" The last words carried a threat that made Sage rear back with a cry of alarm. Dark tendrils of energy snaked from Seraphina's fingers toward the old donkey, but Ember leaped between them, her horn blazing. "Don't touch her." "Such spirit," Seraphina purred, seemingly unaffected by the magical backlash. "It will make the harvest all the sweeter. Did you know, little one, that unicorn magic is most potent when extracted during moments of absolute despair?" She gestured, and the shadows in the room began to take shape. Wolves made of darkness, their eyes like burning coals. They circled the small family with predatory patience. "I could take you now," Seraphina continued, "but where's the artistry in that? Better to let you run, let you hope, build that hope into something beautiful and bright, than crush it when you think you're safe." Ember's breathing came in short, panicked bursts, but her voice remained defiant. "The mountains won't let you take me. They know what you are." Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between the sorceress and his adopted family. "Then you'll have to go through me." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of it. You're far too entertaining." Seraphina moved toward the door, her shadow wolves dissolving back into ordinary darkness. "I'll give you 3 days. Run far, run fast, make it interesting. But know this, when I come for you again, I won't be alone." The circle has decided the time for games is over. She paused at the threshold, rain and wind swirling around her like a personal storm. "Ember, dear, ask your surrogate father about the dreams he's been having, the ones where he watches you die. Ask him how long he's known this day would come." With that, she vanished into the tempest, leaving only the echo of cruel laughter and the lingering scent of ozone and ash. The crystalline formations along the cave walls pulsed with an inner light that seemed to respond to Stella's presence. Marcus watched in wonder as the young unicorn stepped carefully through the ancient chamber, her horn casting prismatic rainbows across surfaces that had remained hidden for millennia. "She's awakening something," Juniper whispered, her voice echoing softly in the vast space. The donkey had insisted on accompanying them despite Marcus's concerns about the treacherous mountain path. Now he understood why. This place called to her as much as it did to her daughter. The cave system stretched deeper than Marcus had imagined when he'd first noticed the strange glow emanating from what he'd assumed was merely another limestone cavern. But this was no ordinary geological formation. Symbols covered every surface, carved deep into the rock and filled with the same luminescent material that made up Stella's horn. As they moved forward, the symbols began to glow more brightly, as if recognizing something long absent. "This is where they lived," Marcus murmured, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. Not just visited or passed through. This was their home. A low rumble filled the chamber as Stella's horn made contact with the archway. The stone seemed to drink in her light, and suddenly the carvings weren't just glowing, they were moving. The images shifted and flowed like living memories, telling a story that had waited centuries for the right witness. Marcus saw the truth unfold before his eyes. The unicorns hadn't simply vanished from the world. They had retreated here, to this sacred place, when the age of magic began to fade. They had known that their time was ending, but they had also known it would return, so they had prepared, choosing guardians and creating sanctuaries, waiting for the moment when the world would need them again. The earthquake, Marcus realized aloud. It wasn't just chance that brought Juniper to me, the mountain was calling her home. As if responding to his words, the floor beneath their feet began to shift. But instead of the violent shaking he'd experienced during the earthquake, this movement was gentle, purposeful. Stone panels slid aside to reveal stairs leading deeper into the mountain's heart. Stella looked back at Marcus and Juniper, her dark eyes holding an intelligence far beyond her apparent age. Without hesitation, she began descending the newly revealed stairway. Marcus felt his chest tighten with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Every instinct told him they were approaching something momentous. The stairs led to a circular chamber carved from what appeared to be a single massive gemstone. The walls reflected and amplified Stella's light until the entire space blazed like the heart of a star. In the center stood a pool of water so clear it seemed like liquid crystal, its surface perfectly still despite the magical energies swirling around them. Stella approached the pool with reverence, and as her reflection appeared in its depths, the water began to sing. The sound was unlike anything Marcus had ever heard, not quite music, not quite language, but something that spoke directly to the soul. Images formed in the water's surface, showing him visions that stole his breath away. He saw other unicorns stirring in distant places, awakening from enchanted slumbers as they sensed their sister's presence. He saw humans like himself, scattered across the world, who had been chosen as guardians without even knowing it. He saw a future where magic and mundane existence found balance once again, where the ancient wisdom wasn't lost, but integrated into a world desperately in need of wonder. But with the visions of hope came warnings. Dark shapes moved at the edges of the images, forces that would seek to capture or control what Stella represented. The knowledge that unicorns had returned to the world wouldn't remain secret for long, and not everyone who learned of it would have pure intentions. "We're not just guardians," Marcus whispered as understanding dawned. "We're the first line of defense." Juniper moved closer to him, her warm bulk a comforting presence as the weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders. He'd spent years hiding from the world, choosing solitude over the complications of human connection. Now he found himself at the center of something that could affect all of existence. Stella touched her horn to the water's surface, and the pool erupted in gentle light. When the glow faded, she turned to face Marcus directly. In that moment, he felt the full force of the ancient compact that bound them together. Protector and protected, human and unicorn, past and future, intertwined in ways that defied simple understanding. The mountain had kept its secrets for centuries, but now the time for hiding was over. The ancient stone chamber thrummed with power as Marcus stepped across the threshold, Luna close behind him. The crystalline formations that lined the walls pulsed with the same ethereal light that had always emanated from Luna's offspring, the creature they'd come to call Star. But here, in this sacred space deep within the mountain's heart, that light felt different, older, primordial. "This is where it all began," Marcus whispered, his voice echoing off the carved walls. Symbols covered every surface, depicting scenes he was only now beginning to understand. Winged beings descending from star-filled skies, ancient peoples kneeling in reverence, and donkeys, always donkeys, standing as guardians and companions to these celestial visitors. Luna's soft nickering drew his attention to the chamber's center, where a circular pool of still water reflected the dancing lights above. Star stood at its edge, no longer the small, uncertain creature that had emerged from Luna months ago. The being had grown, its form shifting between the physical and something beyond mortal comprehension. Wings of pure light flickered in and out of existence along its shoulders, and its eyes held depths that seemed to contain entire galaxies. "The time of choosing approaches," Star spoke, its voice harmonizing with itself in impossible ways. "The ancient compact must be renewed, or all that was preserved will be lost." Marcus felt the weight of generations pressing down upon him. Through Luna's memories, somehow now accessible to him, he could see the truth of his family's legacy. His grandfather hadn't been the simple hermit he'd believed. None of them had been. For centuries, the mountain families had served as guardians, protecting these sacred spaces and preparing for this moment. The water in the pool began to ripple, showing visions of the world beyond their mountain sanctuary. Cities sprawled across landscapes that had once been pristine wilderness. Skies choked with pollution blocked out the stars. Humanity had forgotten its connection to the cosmos, to the ancient agreements made when the star beings first visited Earth. "What happens if I say no?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer would change nothing. "Some responsibilities chose you, whether you wanted them or not." "The barriers weaken daily," Star replied, gesturing toward the chamber walls. For the first time, Marcus noticed the cracks spiderwebbing through the ancient stone. Without a willing guardian to renew the compact, this sanctuary will fall. The last of my kind on this world will fade, and with us, the knowledge we've preserved. Luna moved to Marcus's side, pressing her warm flank against his leg. In that touch, he felt her unwavering faith in him, her certainty that he would make the right choice. She had carried this burden across impossible distances, enduring abuse and hardship to bring Star to this place. How could he do any less? "The ritual requires sacrifice," Star continued, its form becoming more translucent. "Not of life, but of the world you've known. To become the new guardian means accepting a longer existence, one measured in centuries rather than decades. You would be bound to this mountain, its protector and keeper of its secrets." Marcus thought of his cabin, his simple life of solitude and self-sufficiency. He thought of the town below, where people lived and died without ever knowing of the ancient powers sleeping beneath their feet. A part of him mourned the loss of that simplicity. But then he remembered the moment he'd first found Luna, broken and afraid in that roadside ditch. He remembered the wonder of Star's birth, the way it had filled his world with purpose he'd never known he was missing. Some things were worth preserving, even at great personal cost. "Tell me what I need to do," he said. Star's form solidified slightly, as if his acceptance had strengthened its hold on this reality. "Place your hand upon the water's surface, speak the words I give you, and accept the binding that has protected this place since time immemorial." The pool's surface gleamed like liquid starlight as Marcus knelt beside it. The words Star whispered in his mind were in no human language, yet their meaning resonated in his bones. As he spoke them aloud, the chamber filled with harmonious tones that seemed to come from the mountain itself. Power flowed up through his fingers where they touched the water, racing through his veins like liquid fire. He felt his consciousness expanding, touching the network of ley lines that ran through the mountain's heart. Ancient knowledge flooded his mind. The true history of the star beings, the location of other sanctuaries around the world, the names and faces of guardians who had served before him. Luna touched her nose to his cheek, her eyes bright with pride and something that might have been relief. Star's form had stabilized, no longer flickering between states of being. "It is done," the star being said. "The compact is renewed. Now we prepare for what comes next." The ancient chamber trembled as Ilara's light pulsed stronger, her horn blazing like a beacon against the encroaching darkness. The shadow creatures recoiled, their forms wavering, but Marcus could see they weren't retreating. They were regrouping, gathering strength from something deeper in the mountain's depths. "There are too many," he gasped, swinging his makeshift torch at a tendril of darkness that reached for Elara. The flame connected, and the shadow shrieked, dissolving momentarily before reforming. "We need to get out of here." But Elara stepped forward instead of back, her small hooves clicking against the stone floor with surprising determination. The yearling had grown so much in the past months, no longer the fragile creature that had emerged from Sage's womb. Her coat shimmered with an inner radiance that seemed to push against the very walls of the cavern. "What are you doing?" Marcus whispered, but he could see it in her eyes, the same ancient knowledge that sometimes flickered there when she looked at the stars. She knew something he didn't. The shadows pressed closer, and Marcus felt the temperature drop until his breath came out in visible puffs. Ice began forming on the chamber walls, and he realized with growing horror that these weren't just shadow creatures. They were drawing the very warmth from the mountain itself, leeching the life force from everything around them. Sage brayed urgently from behind them, and Marcus turned to see more shadows pouring in through the passage they'd entered. They were surrounded, trapped in this ancient place that had become a prison of living darkness. That's when Elara began to sing. It wasn't the gentle humming she sometimes made while grazing, or the soft nickers of contentment when Marcus scratched behind her ears. This was something altogether different, a sound that seemed to resonate not just in the air, but in the very stones beneath their feet. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with harmonies that human throats could never produce. The shadows stopped their advance, their forms flickering uncertainly. Some of the smaller ones began to dissipate entirely, as if the song itself was unmaking them. But the larger shadows, the ones with burning red eyes, seemed to grow more solid, more real, feeding off their own fury at the sound. Marcus felt something shift in the chamber's atmosphere. The carved symbols on the walls began to glow with the same soft light as Elara's horn, and he realized they weren't just decorative. They were some kind of ancient script, a language that predated anything he'd ever seen. The words seemed to pulse in rhythm with Elara's song, as if the two were connected across impossible spans of time. "The binding song," he whispered, the knowledge coming to him from somewhere deep in his memory. His grandmother's stories, the ones she'd told him about the old magic that once protected these mountains. "You're singing the binding song." Elara's melody grew stronger, more complex, weaving patterns of sound that made the air itself seem to shimmer. The shadows writhed, some fleeing toward the deeper passages, while others pressed their attack with desperate fury. One of the largest creatures lunged at the unicorn, its claws extended toward her throat. Marcus threw himself forward without thinking, his torch connecting with the shadow's center mass. The impact sent him sprawling, but it gave Elara the moment she needed to reach the crescendo of her song. The chamber exploded with light, not just from her horn now, but from every carved symbol, every crystalline formation, every surface that had been touched by the ancient magic. The shadows screamed as one, a sound like wind through broken glass. And then they were gone. Not just retreated or hidden, but truly gone, as if they had never existed at all. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by a warmth that seemed to emanate from the very stones. Marcus struggled to his feet, his ears ringing from the intensity of Elara's song. The unicorn stood in the center of the chamber, her sides heaving with exhaustion, but her horns still glowing with soft, steady light. Around them, the ancient carvings continued to pulse gently, as if the mountain itself was slowly awakening from a long, troubled sleep. "The Guardians," he breathed, understanding flooding through him as he looked at the walls with new eyes. This place, it was meant to keep them bound, the shadows. But something went wrong, didn't it? Something broke the binding. Sage approached cautiously, nuzzling her extraordinary offspring with gentle concern. Elara leaned into her mother's touch, the last notes of her song fading into echoes that seemed to promise peace. Marcus realized they had stumbled into something far greater than he'd imagined. These mountains held secrets that stretched back to the dawn of magic itself, and somehow, impossibly, a reclusive man and an abused donkey had become part of a story that had been waiting centuries to reach its conclusion. But as the chamber's light settled into a steady, comfortable glow, he couldn't shake the feeling that their real test was yet to come. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like forgotten prayers as Marcus led Vera and the young Alicorn down the treacherous path toward the valley. Each step felt weighted with the gravity of what they were leaving behind. 16 years of solitude, of carefully constructed walls, of a life built on the simple premise that the world below held nothing but disappointment and pain. The Alicorn, whom Vera had taken to calling Lumina, moved with an otherworldly grace despite her youth. Her silver coat caught the filtered sunlight streaming through the pine canopy, and her small horn seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Every few minutes she would pause to examine something, a butterfly, a dewdrop on a spider's web, a pattern in the bark of an ancient tree, as if seeing the world through eyes that perceived layers of magic invisible to others. "She's saying goodbye," Vera murmured, her breath visible in the cool mountain air. The donkey's intuitive understanding of the young creature's emotions had only deepened over the past weeks. Marcus adjusted the pack on his shoulders, feeling the weight of his few possessions and the responsibility he now carried. The Council of Keepers had been clear in their instructions: bring the Alicorn to the sanctuary in the valley where others of her kind had once thrived. There, ancient protection still held, and she could grow into her power without the constant threat of discovery by those who would exploit her gifts. "You don't have to come with us," he said to Vera, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. The bond between the donkey and Lumina had become unbreakable, a connection that transcended species and spoke to something deeper about love and protection. Vera's response was a gentle nudge against his shoulder and a look that clearly communicated what she thought of his suggestion. They were a family now, strange and unlikely as it was, and families didn't abandon each other when the path grew difficult. As they descended, the landscape began to change. The harsh granite faces of the upper mountains gave way to gentler slopes covered in thick forests of oak and maple. Streams chattered alongside the path, their voices growing stronger as smaller tributaries joined the flow. The air itself felt different here, charged with an energy that made Lumina's horn glow brighter and her steps more eager. By midday they reached a clearing where Marcus called for a rest. Lumina immediately bounded toward a circle of standing stones, partially hidden by moss and creeping vines. As she approached, the stones began to emit a soft luminescence, responding to her presence like old friends, recognizing a long-lost companion. "This was one of their places," Marcus said, settling beside Vera as they watched Lumina explore the ancient monument. "The keepers told me there are markers like this throughout the valley, waypoints that will guide us to the sanctuary." The Alicorn placed her small horn against the central stone, and suddenly the air filled with whispers, not words exactly, but something deeper. Images flickered around them like translucent memories, alicorns running through moonlit meadows, their horns blazing like stars, gatherings around springs where the water itself seemed to sing, scenes of harmony between the magical creatures and the humans who had once protected them. But darker images followed, scenes of hunting and capture, of cages and exploitation, of a great exodus as the surviving alicorns fled deeper into the mountains or across the ocean to distant lands. The last image was of a mare, heavy with foal, seeking refuge in the highest peaks, her sacrifice ensuring her offspring's survival even as it cost her own life. Lumina stepped back from the stone, her young face grave with understanding. She looked at Marcus and Vera with eyes that held depths of knowledge far beyond her months of life. In that moment, they all understood the true weight of what they were carrying, not just the responsibility for one young alicorn's safety, but the hope of an entire species' survival. As they prepared to continue their descent, Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest. For so long he had protected himself by caring for nothing beyond his immediate survival. The world had seemed safer when viewed from a distance, when other people's problems remained other people's problems. But now, watching Lumina's wonder at each new discovery, seeing Vera's fierce protective instincts, he realized that isolation had never truly protected him. It had only made him smaller. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the trees when they caught their first glimpse of the valley below. It spread out before them like a hidden world, lush and green, and somehow untouched by the harshness of the mountain peaks above. Somewhere down there lay the sanctuary, and with it, the next chapter of their journey. As they began the final descent, Lumina let out a clear, bell-like call that echoed across the valley. And from somewhere in the distance, impossible but unmistakable, came an answering call that made Marcus's heart race with possibility. They were no longer alone. The morning sun painted the mountainside in shades of gold and amber as Thomas stood at the edge of his property, watching the impossible sight before him. Where once his humble cabin had stood alone against the wilderness, now a small village of wooden structures dotted the clearing. Families who had made the treacherous journey up the mountain paths were already tending gardens, their children's laughter echoing off the rock faces. Luna grazed peacefully nearby, her coat gleaming with an otherworldly shimmer that caught the light. The changes in her had become more pronounced over the months since Astra's birth. Her eyes held depths of ancient wisdom, and sometimes Thomas swore he could hear her thoughts as clearly as spoken words. She had become something between donkey and guardian spirit, a bridge between the mundane world and the magic that now flowed freely through these peaks. Astra herself had grown beyond anything Thomas could have imagined. No longer the fragile, luminescent foal he had helped deliver, she stood nearly as tall as her mother, her horns spiraling upward like crystallized starlight. Her presence had transformed not just the mountain, but everyone who encountered her. The bitter hermit. Thomas had once been felt like a stranger now, replaced by someone who understood that isolation was never the answer to pain. "She's calling them," Luna's voice whispered in his mind, as clear as the mountain air. Thomas no longer startled at these moments of communication. They had become as natural as breathing. "More are coming," he asked aloud, knowing the answer even as the words left his lips. Astra lifted her head from where she had been nuzzling a cluster of wildflowers that bloomed impossibly bright in her presence. Her eyes, deep as mountain lakes and filled with swirling galaxies, met his. In that gaze, Thomas saw the future unfolding, a steady stream of seekers, healers, and broken souls, drawn by something they couldn't name but desperately needed. Elder Marta emerged from the largest of the new buildings, her weathered hands dusted with flour from the morning's bread-making. The old woman had appointed herself the unofficial leader of their growing community, and Thomas was grateful for her steady presence. She had a way of organizing chaos that reminded him of his grandmother, and her stories of the old magic had helped him understand the magnitude of what they were protecting. "The Morrison family arrived before dawn," she reported, settling beside him on the wooden bench he had built overlooking the valley. "3 children, all of them touched by something dark. The youngest hasn't spoken in 2 years. Thomas nodded, unsurprised. They always came carrying wounds that conventional medicine couldn't heal. Astra's gift wasn't just about physical ailments. She mended tears in the fabric of the soul itself, wounds that festered in places beyond the reach of ordinary remedies. "And the others?" he asked, watching as Astra approached the newest arrivals with her characteristic, gentle curiosity. "Dr. Chen thinks the research station will be operational by winter. She's convinced there's a scientific explanation for all of this, bless her stubborn heart." Marta chuckled, the sound warm with affection. "Young Marcus has been documenting everything, says the world needs to know when the time is right." The transformation hadn't been without its challenges. Government officials had come sniffing around twice, drawn by reports of unusual activity in the mountains. Each time, a convenient fog had rolled in, and the visitors had found themselves hopelessly lost until Astra chose to let them find their way out again, their memories curiously foggy about what they'd been investigating. Thomas understood now that this had always been the mountain's purpose. The ancient texts Marta had shared spoke of sanctuaries like this one, hidden places where magic could flourish away from the world's harsh scrutiny. He had been chosen not just to protect Astra, but to shepherd the rebirth of something the world had forgotten it needed. Do you ever regret it? Marta asked quietly. The quiet life you had before? Thomas considered the question, watching as Astra lowered her horn to touch the forehead of the silent Morrison child. Light flowed between them like liquid starlight, and for the first time in 2 years the little girl laughed, a sound pure as mountain springs. I thought I wanted solitude, he said finally. Turns out I just needed the right kind of noise. As the sun climbed higher, painting the peaks in brilliant white, Thomas felt the familiar stirring that meant more travelers were approaching. Somewhere on the winding mountain paths, another group of seekers was making their way toward sanctuary, drawn by dreams and half-remembered legends. The reclusive mountain man who had once turned away from the world was gone forever. In his place stood a guardian, a guide, and a witness to miracles. The mountain had claimed him completely, and he had never been more grateful to be lost.